Hello, everyone, and welcome to PCR's February Virtual Transition Times. My name is Melissa Wyman, and I am PCR's Respite Care and Community Engagement Director. Paula? I will be your moderator this evening, so please feel free to send any questions or comments in the chat box below. We are delighted to offer this presentation with American Sign Language simultaneous interpretation. We will also be offering this presentation with Spanish simultaneous interpretation. To access the channels in Spanish, click Interpretation in the meeting control and select the Spanish channel. Participants in a language channel will hear the translated audio and also the original audio at a lower volume. To hear the interpreted language only, click Mute Original Audio. The English and Spanish language versions will be archived in the PCR website Transition Times page. Please share the recording and upcoming Transition Times programs with your friends and others in the community. It is very important to continue to spread the word about Transition Times so we can continue to better serve our community. I want to give a special thanks to Heidi De Paula, PCR volunteer, and Rita Scheinberg, MC Transitions. Thank you for all of your help with Transition Times and the dedication to our families and their loved ones. Just some Zoom tip reminders. We are using the webinar platform. We will wait for questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to submit any of your questions in the chat box below. Click Show Captions to see the captions for the webinar. You must select the speaking language you would like to show. We are very fortunate tonight to have as our presenter Michael Dalto, High Note Consulting. And Michael is the SSI, SSDI guru, and we are happy to have him back again. Michael?
Thank you very much, Melissa. So a 95-year-old Italian man was on his deathbed, and he was fading fast. But suddenly he smelled his favorite aroma in the world, homemade ravioli simmering in homemade sauce. And the scent revived him a bit, and he managed to crawl out of bed and stumble down the hallway into the kitchen, where sure enough, on the stove, a pot of ravioli was simmering in homemade sauce. And he was delighted, and he grabbed a fork and was just about to spear one of the raviolis when a wooden spoon whacked him on the hand, and he turned and saw his wife's glaring face, and she said to him, "That's not for you, that's for the wake." And I think of that story sometimes when I think that oftentimes just when we think we're about to get a reward, life has other plans for us. And some of you may have gotten to the point where you feel like you understand the SSI program, which we've covered on a different webinar. Stands for Supplemental Security Income, a different benefit that people can get from Social Security. And you may have felt like you've just mastered that enough. You have a pretty good understanding when suddenly you have to deal with Social Security disability instead, often abbreviated as SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance. So many people start out on SSI, then get switched to SSDI. Other people start out with SSDI from the start. I am going to pepper this presentation with some comparisons between SSDI, our topic of the evening, and SSI, which we've covered at another time, so that you can compare them a bit. Next slide, please. So Social Security Disability, or SSDI, is a cash benefit that people can get from Social Security if they're eligible. To be eligible, you have to have a significant disability, be at least 18 years old, and have worked and paid into the system. When you work for pay, at least when you work for pay legally, you pay Social Security taxes on your earnings. If you're working for an employer, those taxes are taken out of your pay. You can find an item on your pay stub that may be called FICA or Social Security tax. If you're self-employed, you pay self-employment tax, which is the Social Security tax. And if you pay enough Social Security taxes on your earnings, then you can have what's known as insured status. When you pay the Social Security taxes, it's kind of like paying insurance premiums. And then when you've paid enough premiums, then you can qualify for the benefit. So to be eligible for SSDI, have to be disabled, significantly disabled, same as SSI, have to be at least 18 years old. Actually, you could be a child or any age and get SSI. And you have to have worked and paid into the system to get SSDI. That's different from SSI, which is based on financial need. You have to have low income and low assets. You don't ever have to have worked a day in your life to qualify for SSI if you're financially needy enough. But you must have worked and paid Social Security taxes on your earnings to qualify for SSDI. Although there are some people who qualify for SSDI not on their own work history, but on a parent's work history. So their parent is the one who's worked and paid Social Security taxes on their earnings. Some people get SSDI on a parent's work record rather than their own, and we will be talking about that as well. Next slide, please. Now, those of you who are familiar with SSI may recall that you have to have limited assets, also known as resources, things like bank accounts, retirement accounts, etc. However, there is no limit on resources or assets for SSDI. You could have millions of dollars in the bank and still qualify for SSDI. Another difference between SSDI and SSI is that when a person gets SSI, because it's based on financial need, if they have other income, that will usually reduce the amount of SSI they can get because they would be considered not as financially needy if they've got other money. Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI, is not affected by other income. If a person gets SSDI and they get other income like a pension or retirement benefits or unemployment, for example, veterans benefits, they won't have any impact on SSDI. Although there are some limits on earnings from work that we'll get into in a little bit. That's a big topic for this evening. And there is one kind of income that people don't work for directly, that's not like wages or business income, that does reduce SSDI, and that's workers' compensation. But that's the only exception. Other types of income aside from earnings from work have no effect on Social Security disability. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are two ways to get Social Security disability. Actually, there's a third way, but it's only for widows and widowers who are disabled and over age 50. It's pretty rare. I'm assuming it won't be relevant for any of you, so I'm not going to cover that this evening. But the two common ways to get Social Security disability are on the work record of the person with a disability themselves. They're the one who has worked and paid Social Security taxes on their earnings. That's generally abbreviated as SSDI. And the benefit that you can get on a parent's work record. That benefit is technically called a childhood disability benefit, CDB for short, but it's probably more commonly known as disabled adult child, or DAC, or DAC for short. However, many people just lump both benefits under the abbreviation SSDI. But DAC, DAC is also a very common abbreviation for Social Security disability that a person gets on their parents' work record. Next slide, please. So let's start with SSDI that a person gets on their own work record. So a person has to have worked and paid Social Security taxes on their earnings long enough to have what's known as insured status to qualify for SSDI on their own work history. Next slide, please. To get the childhood disability benefit, better known as disabled adult child or DAC benefit, the criteria are different. It's the parent who must have worked and paid Social Security taxes on their earnings, not the son or daughter with a disability. But the son or daughter with a disability has to be at least 18 years old, has to be an adult. Their disability had to start before age 22, and they have to have at least one parent who has insured status, who worked and paid Social Security taxes on their earnings long enough. And the parent must be either retired and getting Social Security retirement benefits, or the parent must be disabled and getting SSDI on their own work record, or the parent must be deceased. So these are the criteria that can qualify a person for the DAC, or disabled adult child benefit, on a parent's record. And I'm willing to bet that many, possibly most of you who are participating this evening may be here on behalf of someone who's getting the disabled adult child benefit. I should mention, though, it's possible for a person to get both SSDI on their own work record and the disabled adult child benefit on a parent's work record. You can get both at the same time. What would happen in that case is the person gets the SSDI on their own record first. If the benefit that they'd be eligible for on the parent's record, the DAC benefit, is greater than the SSDI benefit on their own record, then they would get the SSDI on their own record, and they would get the difference between the two benefits on the parent's record. For example, if a person's eligible for $800 a month of SSDI on their own record, but they'd be eligible for $1,200 a month of the disabled adult child benefit on their parent's record, they would get the $800 SSDI benefit first, and they'd get the difference between the two. They'd get $400 from the disabled adult child benefit as well. Next slide, please. So how disabled does a person need to be to qualify for Social Security disability? Well, they have to have a severe disability that's lasted or is expected to last at least a year, or is a terminal illness. And the disability has to limit the person's ability to work. It has to prevent them from doing what Social Security considers substantial work. That's usually earnings of at least $1,550 a month before taxes in 2024. That amount usually goes up every January. And that amount is higher for blind people. For a blind person, they would have to be earning at least $2,590 a month in 2024 to be considered to be doing substantial work. Now, notice this slide does not say you must be unable to work to qualify for SSDI, though that's a persistent myth. Many people believe that if you're able to work at all, you can't qualify for SSDI. That's absolutely false. I know many people who are capable of working, many people who are actually working even when they applied for SSDI and still qualified. Your disability has to limit your ability to work, but not necessarily prevent you from working at all. Next slide. So how much is the benefit amount you can get from SSDI? That depends on the average lifetime earnings of the worker, of the person with a disability who is getting SSDI on their own record, or their parents' work record, if they're getting a benefit on the parents' record. Social Security takes average lifetime monthly earnings adjusted for inflation. They plug them into a formula, and that formula determines the SSDI benefit amount they should get. So as you would expect, the higher the lifetime average earnings, the higher the SSDI benefit, and the lower the average earnings, the lower the benefit. The maximum benefit for SSDI this year is $3,822 a month. But the average is much less than that, less than half of that. Average benefit is $1,537 a month. And I've known some people who were getting as little as under $200 a month from SSDI and everything in between. Compare that to SSI, which has a maximum monthly benefit this year of $943 a month for an unmarried individual. So on average, SSDI pays substantially more than SSI. Next slide, please. There is a medical benefit that comes along with SSDI, and it's Medicare. But there's a catch. Person has to be entitled to SSDI for 2 years, for 24 straight months, before their Medicare will start. Contrast that with SSI. SSI provides a medical benefit. It's a different one called Medicaid, also known as medical assistance in the state of Maryland. But there's no waiting period. If you get SSI, you're automatically and immediately eligible for Medicaid or medical assistance. With SSDI, you get Medicare, but only after a 2-year wait. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that some people start out on SSI and then switch to SSDI. When would that happen? Well, a person may be getting SSI initially, and then they start working. They pay Social Security taxes on their earnings, and eventually they can have insured status and qualify for SSDI on their own work record. The younger the person, the less work they need to do to qualify for SSDI. Somebody who's under age 24 could get SSDI, could have insured status with as little as less than 18 months of work. People who are older typically would need at least 10 years of work to qualify. the 10 years are not necessarily consecutive. So a person might start out on SSI, go to work, and eventually switch to SSDI on their own record. Another way to make the transition is for the person to start out on SSI and then have a parent start getting Social Security retirement or Social Security disability, or the parent may pass away. So if you're on this webinar this evening and the person or people on whose behalf you're attending are mostly or entirely receiving just SSI, it's still worth it for you to participate in this because people who start out on SSI often switch to Social Security disability later. Next slide, please. So what happens if you start out on SSI and then switch to SSDI? If the SSDI benefit is low enough, a person may get a limited SSI payment in addition. This year, in the state of Maryland, if a person's SSDI benefit is less than $963 a month, they may also qualify for a little bit of SSI. So people with low SSDI benefits can get two benefits at the same time, SSDI and a little SSI. But most people who get SSDI get at least $963 a month of it. You saw earlier that the average is over $1,500 a month. And if their SSDI benefit is $963 a month or more, the SSI will stop. But there are ways that they can keep Medicaid even if SSI stops. Next slide, please. So my favorite part, what happens if a person gets Social Security disability and then they start paid work? Initially, they may panic because everybody has heard horror stories about the impact of work on disability benefits. But the good news is there are safety nets called work incentives that limit the effect of work on benefits like SSDI and ensure that people can keep essential benefits they need and that they will come out ahead financially by working. And let's get into them now. Next slide, please. So what do the work incentives do? They do three primary things. The SSDI work incentives let a person keep their full SSDI benefit longer and in many cases indefinitely while they work. They also protect medical benefits, enable a person to keep their Medicare once they've started it, even if they earn enough to stop their SSDI benefits. And finally, there are a couple of work incentives that help a person who's worked their way off SSDI, but then later has seen their earnings drop or they've stopped working. These work incentives let the person get their SSDI payments back quickly and easily without having to reapply in that case. Next slide, please. So the SSDI program has three phases of work incentives. And they always occur consecutively. You finish phase one, then you move into phase two. When that's finished, then you move into phase three. Next slide, please. Phase one is called the trial work period, or TWP for short. Phase two is called the extended period of eligibility, or EPE for short. And phase three is post extended period of eligibility, or post EPE for short. Incidentally, looking at these very long terms for work incentives and benefits that Social Security uses highlights one of the rules for bureaucrats trying to confuse the public. Never use one syllable if 9 would do just as well. Next slide, please. So through all 3 phases of work incentives, there are some issues that must apply at all times. A person must be considered to be medically disabled to remain eligible for benefits throughout all 3 phases. So as long as the person has not medically improved, they can still be protected by the work incentives. Another thing to know about SSDI and DAC benefits is that they are all or nothing benefits. A person gets the full amount or they get 0 if they have worked their way off the benefit. Nothing in between. This is different from SSI. With SSI, the benefit amount can fluctuate up or down according to the amount of other income the person has. But with SSDI, you either get the full benefit or nothing. Also necessary to note that when a person who gets SSDI or DAC, I'm just going to refer to it as SSDI to cover both benefits going forward, just to keep it simple. When a person who gets SSDI goes to work, Social Security periodically conducts work reviews. They review the person's earnings and they figure out which work incentive phase the person is in and whether their SSDI benefit should continue. Next slide, please. So the first phase, as I said, is called the trial work period, or TWP. And this is generally the first 9 months that a person works at a certain level, receives earnings above a certain amount. That amount in 2024 is $1,110 in pre-tax earnings. The nice thing about the trial work period is no matter how much a person earns during it, they keep their full SSDI benefit. They could be earning tens of thousands of dollars a month and still keep SSDI. Now, if a person earns less than $1,110 a month in a month, that month would not be one of their 9 trial work period months, and their SSDI would still continue. If they earn $1,110 in a month or more, that month would be one of their 9 trial work period months. But no matter how high their earnings, they would still keep the full SSDI. The 9 months are not necessarily consecutive. Some people work some months, but not others. Some work some months earning at least $1,110, but other months they're earning less. So it's generally the first 9 months with earnings of at least $1,110 a month this year. Each year, that amount goes up, the amount you'd have to earn to use a trial work month. Next slide, please. After phase 1 ends, after the person has used up their 9th trial work month, they move into phase 2. That's the extended period of eligibility, or EPE. The 9 months of the trial work period were not necessarily consecutive, but the EPE is always 36 consecutive months. So 3 years in a row. And it starts the very next month after the 9th and final trial work period month. So if your trial work period ends in February 2024, this month, your extended period of eligibility will begin the next month, March 2024, and it will be 36 consecutive months, which means it will end February of 2027. So what happens during the EPE? If a person's earnings are substantial, Social Security calls it substantial gainful activity. Again, following that rule, for bureaucrats trying to confuse the public, if earnings are substantial gainful activity, or SGA for short, then the SSDI payment will stop for that month. But the payment is only suspended or paused. It's not terminated. The person is still considered eligible for SSDI. They just didn't get it in that 1 month because their earnings were substantial gainful activity. The good thing about having the payments only suspended and not terminated is that if earnings drop back below SGA the next month, the person can get the benefit back without having to reapply, just by notifying Social Security. Next slide, please. Let's go back one. Back one slide there. Thank you. So I like to think of phase 2, the EPE, as being kind of like trial work period light. It's not as good as the trial work period, because during the trial work period, no matter how high your earnings, you still keep your SSDI. In phase 2, the EPE, if you earn enough in a month, you won't get SSDI that month. But if your earnings drop below SGA any month after that during the EPE, you just notify Social Security and they will restart the SSDI payments. Next slide, please. It's only after the EPE ends that the moment of truth arrives. So after the 9-month trial work period and the 36-month EPE comes phase 3, the post-EPE period. If a person does SGA, substantial gainful activity, in the post-EPE period, their SSDI payments will terminate. They'll stop for good. And if their earnings later drop or stop, they can't simply call Social Security to get them restarted. But they do still have a quicker and easier way to get benefits back in that situation, quicker and easier than reapplying and starting all over from scratch. And that's called expedited reinstatement. Next slide, please. So expedited reinstatement is a quicker and easier way to get benefits back. It applies if a person is in the post-EPE period and their SSDI has terminated due to work because they continued to do SGA, substantial gainful activity, but their earnings have later dropped below SGA or they've stopped working. It's a quicker way than reapplying. It's taking over a year now for most people who are initially applying for SSDI to get approved. It takes months rather than years to get benefits back through expedited reinstatement. Also, the disability evaluation or disability determination that's used for expedited reinstatement is easier than for initial applications. When you first apply for SSDI, the burden of proof is on you to show that you meet Social Security's disability standard. When you ask for expedited reinstatement, all you have to do is show that your disability has not gotten better medically since the last time it was reviewed. So that's an easier standard. Next slide, please. Best of all, with expedited reinstatement, although you do have to wait and you do have to go through a medical review to see if you're eligible, Social Security will give you monthly SSDI payments while you're waiting for that decision on your medical review. They'll give you those monthly payments for up to 6 months. They call them provisional payments. And some of you have been dealing with the disability benefit system for a long time, and you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, it's nice that they'll give you up to 6 months of benefits while you're waiting for the decision. But what if the decision is no? What if the decision is you have medically improved and you're not eligible for benefits? I'll bet you have to pay back the benefits they gave you while you waited. Fortunately, that's not true. Even if they decide you have medically improved and you're not eligible for expedited reinstatement, they won't make you pay back the up to 6 months of benefits they gave you while you waited for the decision. I don't know of another benefit program that does anything quite like that. Next slide, please. So all of this begs a question. During phase 2 and phase 3, the EPE and the post-EPE, what you noted was that the key concept is whether the person's earnings are SGA, substantial gainful activity. So let's talk about what it means. Next slide, please. So when would earnings be considered SGA, or substantial gainful activity? There is a dollar amount assigned to SGA. I mentioned it a little bit earlier. If a person who's not blind earns pre-tax earnings, like gross wages, of at least $1,550 a month this year, they may be doing SGA. A blind person would have to be earning at least $2,590 a month in gross wages to possibly be doing SGA. If a person's earning less than those amounts, they would not be doing SGA. But if a person earns more than $1,550 a month, or more than $2,590 a month if they're blind, that does not necessarily mean they're doing SGA. Next slide, please. The reason is when Social Security determines if your earnings are SGA, they're supposed to look only at the portion of earnings that reflect the person's actual productivity. And oftentimes, the amount a person is paid is not an accurate reflection of their productivity. And there are two reasons for that. One is, in order to earn that money, a person with a disability, a worker with a disability, often must pay for extra expenses for services or equipment that they need because of their disability in order to be able to work. So yes, you got the job done, but you can't really compare your productivity to a non-disabled worker's productivity fairly without looking at the fact that you, the worker with a disability, had to pay extra out of your earnings for those expenses that enabled you to work. The other circumstance is a person might get paid the full wage for their job, but because of their disability, their productivity is actually lower than a typical non-disabled worker in the same position. Maybe they work more slowly because of a disability, or they need more frequent breaks, or they can't fully perform all of the duties of the job. Some duties they can't do because of disability, or maybe they're getting extra help or supervision on the job. All of those factors indicate that a worker with a disability may have a lower rate of productivity than a typical non-disabled worker. So in order to adjust a person's earnings, the pay that they receive, so that the pay more accurately reflects their productivity, Social Security applies two kinds of subtractions from earnings. The first would be those disability-related expenses the person needs to pay for in order to work. Those are called impairment-related work expenses. The value of those gets subtracted from earnings. And the other is called subsidies and special conditions. That means the worker is paid the full wage for their job, but their productivity is less than 100%. And there's a subtraction for that as well. Next slide. So Social Security takes the person's earnings, they subtract the impairment-related work expenses, known as IRWEs for short, subtract the value of the subsidies and special conditions, and see what's left over. If the remaining amount is under the SGA dollar amount of $1,550 a month if the person is not blind, or $2,590 a month if they are blind, then they won't be doing SGA and they can still keep their full SSDI benefit. So it's not so much your earnings, your raw earnings that matter. It's what's left of your earnings after the subtractions. If that's below the SGA dollar amount, you're not doing SGA and can keep your full SSDI. Next slide, please. So let's go through an example. Right now, up until now, I think it's been a little abstract, but I hope that this example will make it clearer. So here's Phoebe, who works full-time, 40 hours a week, earns $15 an hour, which averages out to $2,600 a month gross wages. Incidentally, an average month doesn't have 4 weeks in it. It has 4 1/3 weeks in it. So if you take 40 hours a week times $15 an hour times 4 1/3 weeks per month, you'll get $2,600. So Phoebe has finished her trial work period. She's now in phase 2, the EPE, and she's not blind. So her SGA dollar amount is $1,550 a month. Look at her wages, way more than $1,550 a month. But that doesn't necessarily mean she's doing SGA. Here's why. Phoebe pays $476 a month for taxis to get to and from work because she's unable to drive due to her disability. That's going to be an impairment-related work expense, an IRWE. She's also paid the full wage for her job, but her employer estimates that her productivity level is 70%. So she has a subsidy for reduced productivity. She's paid 100% of the wage. Technically, she's only earning 70% of it because her productivity is 70%. The other 30% she's paid, she's not technically earning. And that would be the amount of the subsidy that would be subtracted from her earnings. 30% of her wage is $780 a month. So far we've got two subtractions, the IRWE for taxis and the subsidy for reduced productivity. Next slide, please. And we've got one more subtraction. Phoebe has a job coach who's helping her on the job. Job coach helps her 10 hours a month. And Social Security figures, okay, well, if the job coach is helping her 10 hours a month, that means the job coach is essentially doing 10 hours a month worth of Phoebe's work. And that 10 hours a month of work that the job coach is doing rather than Phoebe is valued at Phoebe's hourly wage of $15 an hour. So 10 hours a month times $15 an hour is $150. That's the value of Phoebe's pay that it's actually the job coach who's earning in theory. So now we come up with another $150 subtraction from Phoebe's earnings. Next slide, please. The rest is simple subtraction. We start out with Phoebe's $2,600 a month gross wages, subtract the $476 a month impairment-related work expense, or IRWI, for taxis, subtract the $780 a month subsidy, 30% of her earnings because her productivity is only 70%, and we subtract the $150 a month special condition, the value of the help she's getting from the job coach. What's left over is $1,194 a month. That's called her countable income. It's the amount of her earnings that count. Since that's less than the SGA dollar amount of $1,550 a month, Phoebe is not doing SGA and she'll keep her full SSDI. So you'll see from Phoebe's example that some people can earn a lot more than the SGA dollar amount, but still not be doing SGA because they have enough subtractions to keep their countable income below the SGA dollar amount. Next slide, please. Now, suppose a person works above the SGA level and they don't have enough subtractions to get their countable income below the SGA dollar amount. In that case, then they truly are doing SGA. And if they're doing that after the trial work period, they have one more work incentive to delay their benefits from being suspended, and that's called a grace period. The grace period is the first month the person does SGA after the trial work period, in spite of the subtractions, and the 2 consecutive months that follow it. A person will still keep their SSDI those 3 months, even though they may be doing SGA every month. Next slide, please. What if a person is working, say, full-time, and they look at all possible subtractions, IRWIs, subsidies, and special conditions, and there just aren't enough subtractions to get them below SGA, and so their SSDI stops? What happens to their Medicare? Luckily, their Medicare can continue. They can continue Medicare without having to pay anything extra for it for at least 7 years and 9 months after the trial work period ends. After that period, which is at least 7 years and 9 months after the trial work period, if the person is still medically disabled, they can still keep Medicare and they can keep it indefinitely, but they may have to pay an extra premium for it. Next slide, please. And one more slide, please. Now, although I think many of you may be focused on the fact that your relative or yourself, if you're getting SSDI yourself, um, can work over the SGA dollar amount, but use these subtractions to stay under SGA and keep SSDI, which is very important. I did want you to know that it is possible for a person who gets SSDI to earn enough working full time that they'll actually be better off working their way off SSDI. In other words, they'd have more net income through just their full-time wages without SSDI than they would working part-time and keeping SSDI. I wanted to give you an example. So here's Rosina, who started out with only SSDI of $850 a month. She started working 20 hours a week and earning $15 an hour. That would give her monthly earnings, average earnings of $1,300 a month. That's below the SGA amount of $1,550 a month. And she kept her SSDI. But later, she got a better full-time job, working 40 hours a week and earning $18 an hour. She did not have enough subtractions to get her countable income below SGA, so her SSDI stopped. Next slide, please. And here's a bar graph showing a comparison of her net income in three different situations. The first column shows her receiving only the SSDI of $850 a month before she started working. The SSDI appears in blue. The second column shows her working 20 hours a week, keeping the full SSDI. You can see the blue is still there at the $850 level. And then above it is orange or pink or red or whatever it shows up, whatever color it shows up as on your screen. And to give you a sense of her true net income, I also deducted an estimated of the tax that she'd be paying on those earnings. And so now between the SSDI and her wages after taxes, her net income is up around the $2,000 a month level, way better than not working. In the third column, if she's working 40 hours a week, making $18 an hour, and her SSDI stops, you'll see there's no blue in the third column. But even after taxes, her net income is over $2,500 a month. So this person can be better off working her way off SSDI, can have more net income. And if she does, remember there are work incentives that will let her keep Medicare indefinitely, and work incentives like the extended period of eligibility and expedited reinstatement that would let her restart her SSDI without having to start all over and reapply if her earnings later dropped below SGA or if she stopped working. Next slide, please. I also wanted you to know about a great program called the Employed Individuals with Disabilities Program. There are 45 or 46 states that have similar programs. Generically, they're known as Medicaid buy-in programs, but each state also gives it its own unique name. In Maryland, we call it Employed Individuals with Disabilities, or EID for short. Some people have called it IED. That actually stands for Improvised Explosive Device, not exactly the marketing angle the government had in mind. But whatever you call it, it's a powerful incentive to work. The EID program enables a person to qualify for Medicaid, also known as medical assistance, if they're working and meet a few other conditions. They have to have a disability that meets Social Security's medical criteria. Well, a person who gets SSDI meets those criteria. A person who's lost SSDI because of their earnings, but who has not medically improved, meets those criteria. Person has to be 18 to 64 years old. Actually, that's outdated. It's now 16 to 64 years old. That was just changed. They have to be working for pay. They could be working very minimally. I've known people earning less than $50 a month from work who still met the work requirement and have to have assets under $10,000. Next slide, please. If a person uses the EID program to get Medicaid, Medicaid can be a huge boon. If they have no other insurance, Medicaid provides very comprehensive health coverage. So imagine that you've just qualified for SSDI. Remember, we said you get Medicare along with it, but there's a 2-year wait. If you're in the 2-year waiting period and you're getting SSDI, but not yet Medicare, you could get Medicaid through the EID program just with minimal earnings and have comprehensive coverage. If a person has Medicare or private insurance, the Medicaid they get through EID can supplement the Medicare or private insurance, can cover some expenses that Medicare or private insurance does not. And best of all, if a person has Medicare and then they get Medicaid, Medicaid will cover all of the out-of-pocket costs that they would otherwise have to pay for Medicare. Premiums, deductibles, co-insurance. If you get both Medicare and Medicaid in the state of Maryland, the only thing you have to pay for is a small copay for prescriptions. EID does have a monthly premium on a sliding scale for most people. It's 0, 25, 40, or $55 a month. It's only people with fairly high earnings who pay any more than that. So it's a very affordable program. Next slide, please. And finally, you've probably learned just enough from this presentation to be dangerous. So you don't want to be advising a person about the impact of work on their SSDI just based on what you've learned in the last hour or less, I hope. You'd want to hire somebody called a benefits counselor to help people use the work incentives effectively. And luckily, you can hire a benefits counselor at no cost. Next slide, please. You can get free benefits counseling by calling the Ticket to Work helpline at the number on slide 38. If a person's getting SSDI or SSI and they're 14 to 65 years old, and they're either working or actively seeking work, they can get connected with free benefits counseling by calling that number. If the person has instead a case open with DOORS, the Maryland Division of Rehabilitation Services, the DOORS counselor is required to arrange benefits counseling for you at no cost. And I believe that's the last slide. Yes.